my channel for what is probably my favourite video to film every single year, because it's also my favourite video to watch every single year on everyone else's channel, and that is of course my favourite books of the year, this year specifically being 2021. So welcome to my top 10 books of 2021. You know the drill at this point. I don't stick necessarily to books that came out in 2021, but simply books that I read for the first time in the year that I'm talking about. So I did narrow it down to 10 this year. It wasn't that difficult, to be honest. It really felt like these 10, although I'd read a ton of other good books and great books in fact, really, you know, like left their mark on me. Like, this is 10 books that I've thought about a lot, that I've talked about a lot, that I've recommended a lot, that I would most likely consider rereading, and that just like have that something extra special, and I wanted to give them a bit of extra time on my channel and share them all with you once again. So without further ado, let's just look at my favourite books of 2021. I'm going to start with the books I have physical copies of, because I mean that's the easiest way to do it really, and in no particular order. I guess I'm going to grab this book here off the top. So this is such an interesting book and I'm really excited to talk more about it. It's You Let Me In by Camilla Bruce. Now, I picked this book up on the premise that it was a horror novel. I picked up from one of my favourite online bookshops which specialises in horror literature and unnerving literature and scary and thrilling literature, and I'd never heard of it before picking it up on this website. I am so glad that I did. Like, this is one of my best whim purchases of 2021, because obviously it's made it into my favourite books of 2021, and it is definitely one of those novels that, although yes, it is horrifying, it is disturbing in many ways, really crosses genres. Like, it doesn't exclusively feel like a horror novel. It's also something I would very much categorise as literary fiction. Like, the prose in this book are stunning. They're very rich, and it feels like a focus of the novel is the rich writing as much as it is the storyline. It's very thought-provoking. It very much gets inside the main character's head. It's a personal journey and a personal story. It's an exploration of trauma, and yes, it is a very unnerving, unsettling story, which is one of my favourite subgenres of horror. And on top of that, it has these like fantastical notes to it, because what this book focuses in on is our protagonist's experience with the fair folk, or the fae, but the very, very dark traditional fae of certain like folklores. I mean, in a lot of old Scottish folklore, for example, this is true of the fae, that they're actually the dead. So the fae are actually those that have died, and this is their sort of like gruesome, spooky afterlife in a new realm. And that's the kind of fae that we have in this book. This is the fae who are actually the dead, and they basically like suck the life out of humans. They survive on the essence of living creatures, and that informs their appearance in the real world. But what this book also is a book of unreliable narration. You do not really know, or at least in the beginning, you're not entirely sure whether these fae are real or whether they are something that the main character has conjured up to deal with their trauma. So what this book is an exploration of a woman's trauma and a girl's trauma from her early years up through like her teenage years, through her like young adulthood, and to her much, much older adulthood. In the present of the novel, I guess you could say, like, I feel like the point where we're jumping back from, she's an older woman, she's a widow, and she's also a best-selling novelist, and she has gone missing. Her niece and nephew turn up at her house because the will stipulates that if she's been missing for a certain amount of time, they should do that, and discover this unpublished manuscript, which is actually her account of her life. And of course they've heard versions of their aunt's lives from the media, from their parents, from their grandparents, but never her version, and her version is very, very different because it involves these fae creatures. And like I said, this book does deal with a lot of trauma, in particular child abuse, but it's not talked about explicitly because it all exists in the background of what this woman is imagining her life to be, and what she's seeing her life to be, and how she's remembering her life to be, and she isn't really able to grasp or to articulate what truly happened to her. And it's so cleverly done, and like I said, such rich, beautiful prose, very evocative and very emotional. Like, I felt very emotionally wrung out. I also felt very unsettled, like it felt very dark and creeping, and it always felt like there was something else around the corner, and there was these elements of horror from reality and these elements of horror from the fantastical. Really interestingly done and quite hard to articulate what it's all about because it is this kind of double layered story, but it's beautiful, and if you think that might be up your street, I would highly recommend it. It was very compelling, and I definitely want to read more by this author in 2022. Whilst we're on the topic of horror, I guess I want to mention a short story collection. So this is a collection of unnerving, creepy, horror-esque short stories called Cursed Bunny by Bo Ra Chung. So this is a South Korean collection that has been translated into English by Anton Her and published by Honford Star. And again, this is another one a bit like this, which I picked up on a whim. I'd never heard it recommended, or at least I couldn't remember ever being recommended this book, but I saw it on a table in a bookshop, specifically Golden Hare in Edinburgh, and thought, this sounds interesting. I'd recently finished watching Squid Game, like everybody else on the planet, like everybody watched and loved Squid Game in 2021, and that, as you know, is a commentary on capitalism in modern day South Korea and more widely the world. So when I read the blurb of this short story collection, which specifically describes itself as a horror short story collection commenting on both capitalism and patriarchy in South Korea, I thought, hey, these are themes that I'm already engaging with, that I really enjoyed in Squid Game, let's try another medium for them. And this book is so wholly its own. It's not Squid Game, but like I said, there is thematic crossover, but the stories in here are so creative and so imaginative, and I loved every single one. Loved always seems like an odd word to use with something like horror because it's so dark, but my imagination was very much captured by every story. I felt very thoughtful and pensive with each story. It really left me a lot to think about. And that's not something I can say for every short story collection I read. Even if I enjoy a short story collection, there's usually some that for me don't quite live up to the rest, but this one was 100% there. Every single story was fantastic. And they were all a little bit different, but there was obviously thematic crossover between them all. And it was one of those short story collections where you'd start the story and think, this is interesting. But then I wouldn't be able to put the collection down until I finished the story, because with every page I read, I was drawn in further and further, and I was more and more curious. And then it would always throw a surprise my way by the end. There would be a twist or a turn or a little extra caveat there that made it that something special, and I was so impressed by this collection. Again, this is an author I'd really like to read more by. I don't know if they have anything else translated into English, if they have anything else published at all, but I'm definitely going to be looking into it in the new year. And if you know of any more short story horror collections which are translated, I'd love to hear about them, because I feel a lot of the horror I have read has been very US or UK centric, and it's really nice to read horror which is from other parts of the world, because for me what horror does best is comment on the realities of society, and it can do so in such a provocative and evocative way. In a bid to wean off horror, let's move on to a thriller novel that I adored in 2021, and this is The Family Upstairs by Lisa Joe. This is a massive bestseller. You've probably all heard about this book already, and I'd been meaning to read it for a while because my friend Leanne gifted me a copy, and I'm so glad she did, because this book lived beyond the hype for me. I was expecting something compelling. I was expecting a good page turner because I trust Leanne and it had so much hype, but it was even more than that. This is one of those books where you do worry going into it that the hype is going to affect your reading of it and you might not like it as much as you're expecting, but honestly I liked it more. It was so fantastic, and I loved it so much that I've since read 2 more books by Lisa Jewell. She is now an absolute favourite author of mine, and I cannot wait to continue reading her back catalogue as well as read whatever she brings out in the future, including a sequel to this book, which I was not expecting, but that's neither here nor there. this is very much a book you can read as a standalone. And again, it's very skillfully written. I think if you are somebody who's looking to get into thrillers but typically reads a lot more literary fiction than genre fiction, say, I mean, again, I feel like there's just like so much crossover in all of these genres and it's very hard to draw lines between them. But if that's like who you feel you are and are looking for more traditional thrillers, this I feel crosses that bridge very, very well, because it's quite interesting for a thriller. It's not one where you've got like a series of murders taking place in the present day. Instead, it's very much the mystery of this woman's family and their history, and it's told over 2 time periods. So we have the past, which is either in the 80s or 90s, I believe, when her parents were alive and her older siblings were alive, living in this massive, big, expensive townhouse in Chelsea, London, and it's narrated by her older brother. And what we know from the offset of this novel is that her parents committed suicide as part of a suicide pact with another adult who was living in their house at the time, because it turned into a bit of like a cult/commune. Communes can be fantastic, but this was not a healthy one. And after they died, she was taken into foster care because nobody could find her siblings, who were like at least 10, 15 years older than her, and she was just a baby. So she's adopted, and now she's around 25, and she has inherited this house in Chelsea along with all the mysteries surrounding it. And she starts to look into the background of her parents and those siblings that disappeared and what happened, and you're following her in the present day whilst also following her older brother in the past, and a third narrator who you don't know the identity of immediately, so I won't ruin it for you, but it has 3 narrations, 2 in the present day and 1 in the past. It's absolutely fantastic, and I love that structure where you get the past and the present, and you get to watch them both unfold and see how they begin to overlap and how they provide answers to one another. And I loved it. This was fantastic. I can't wait for the sequel, and I can't wait to read more by Lisa Jones. On the complete obverse, I feel, thematically, from the 3 books I've already talked about, we have a contemporary romance. This is Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. This is, as I've already said, a contemporary romance which is all about Chloe Brown. So Chloe Brown has a chronic pain condition. She has fibromyalgia, which was brought on a few years ago, and it changed her life entirely. She stopped hanging out with a lot of her older friends. Her fiance ended up breaking up with her after a while because he didn't understand him. He sounds very toxic from what we get to hear about him in this book, and very selfish, don't like him. And it's been like that for years now. It's very much just been Chloe and her family, but she's sick of it. She has a bit of a near-death experience at the beginning of the book, and she decides to take control of her life once again. She's at a point where she's managing her condition. It still causes her a lot of pain, but she's adjusted to it. She's found coping mechanisms. She has a career which she's really passionate about in web design, and she decides she's moving out. She's been living with her family for a few years, and she decides she's moving out, and she's making a list of things to do in order to get a life, because she considers herself not to have a life. This is very much how Chloe sees herself, and she ends up making friends with the factor or like manager of her tenement building, who's also a reclusive artist named Red, and he ends up helping her with her list. But as she gets to know Red more and more throughout the course of this book, as well as gets to know herself more and more and pushes herself out of her comfort zone, but also discovers the sort of like new Chloe, which is a balance of like the old Chloe and the new Chloe, she realises that maybe her list isn't actually what she needs, and maybe there are different things that she needs and that she wants, and Red might be one of them. And I loved this book. One, the romance was perfection, like such a healthy romance. Fantastic levels of communication, no like really drawn out like sort of unbelievable drama. Like it all felt very honest and relatable and like believable, which was really nice. And it was also a book which very much explored the 2 individual people in that building romance's emotions and lives, because Red has his own stuff going on. Like, I talk about this as if Chloe's the only main character, and she's not. It's from the perspective of Chloe and Red. And Red's actually not long out of quite an abusive relationship. He sort of abandoned his life as an artist and became this recluse, like I mentioned, and he's sort of finding about and he's starting to find his way again of who he wants to be, and he started going to therapy. So we hear a lot about like Chloe's health condition and the way that she's been dismissed by people in the past, and we hear a lot about Red's mental health journey, and it's so fantastic. And they are there for one another, and they're not perfect, you know, sometimes they maybe upset the other one a little bit, but like I said, they communicate, and it's such a beautiful romance to follow, and it's such a beautiful journey to follow both the characters on, not just for their romance but also because of their character growth. Loved it. Was very, very funny as well. There's lots of great humour in this book, and I can't wait to read the rest in this series, which follow Chloe Brown's sisters. We then have some non-fiction. This is We Have Always Been Here, a queer Muslim memoir by Samra Habib. I mean, this one has one of those subtitles where it pretty much like sums it up for you, but I'll talk a little bit more about like my experience with this book. So I actually ended up reading this via audiobook and physical book. Like I listened to some of it and I read some of it, and I will say the audiobook is fantastic, would highly recommend. And I do love a memoir in audiobook format. I think because they're so personal, because they're the author telling you about their life, there's something very nice about listening to somebody read that to you, whether it's the author or an audiobook narrator slash actor. It is really, really nice to have that like personal element, and it felt very conversational, and it felt very much like Samra Habib was inviting you into her life through the audiobook but also the physical book. And I mean, this is like the subtitle tells you, a queer Muslim memoir. It's about Samra, who moves to Canada with her family when she's still a child, so she ends up attending school in Canada, and it's about her coming to terms with her own sexuality, her own gender identity, and also the specific trials that come with being like first generation in a family to sort of grow up in another country. And it's such an uplifting book, because although like Samra goes through a lot, like many people do in the LGBTQ plus community do, like many people who are part of immigrant families do, she also embraces herself. And it's always so beautiful to read about people in the LGBT community. And it's always so beautiful to read about people's lives and people's experiences in the LGBTQ plus community who embrace themselves, who love themselves, who find ways to love themselves, and then actually are able to offer that support to other people. So Samra eventually over her life manages to find more people who are both queer and Muslim and talk to them, and also like explore what it's like for queer Muslims across the world, not just in Canada. And it felt like a very positive journey for all of the sort of ups and downs. It felt like a very positive journey and a very uplifting journey, and I felt, like I said, that I was being invited into her life, and I'm very grateful for her to have shared it with us all. Then lastly, for physical copies, I do have 4 more books I'm going to talk about after this, is a poetry collection, and this is And Then She Ate Him by Tom Denby. So I mean, I've already mentioned this is a poetry collection, and it is one of those poetry collections that reminded me why I love poetry. Like, this book just like totally took me away. It absorbed me entirely and had me like going back and rereading poems and rereading sentences and reading them out loud, and really just like becoming one with the words, which I feel like is what you want from a poetry collection. And these poems in particular often take their inspiration from folktales, fairy tales and myths. So Ganymede's in here, Medusa's in here, sirens are in here, you know, folklore and mythology from lots of different places and lots of different cultures. And you know how much I love when authors use folktale and mythological imagery in their work. It's something that we've been doing since the beginning of time. It's something that, you know, orators were doing in courtrooms in ancient Greece, and I love when people continue to do it today and bring new meaning to these myths and interpret them for a new audience and put their spin on them. It's so interesting, and I felt like Tom Denby did such an incredible job in here. It was very, very evocative in each poem, and it created very, very vivid imagery. It was also just like really beautifully rhythmic. Like, that's what you want from poetry, right? You want something that flows, and I felt like this just flowed. Like, I just read it and it felt so smooth. There was nothing jarring about the lines. They all just worked for me in my brain. And this is the thing, poetry is so individual that what might work for somebody in a poem might not work for somebody else, but for me, my brain was like, yes, this is what I want, this is the poetry for me. So if you know you have similar poetry taste to me, then you have to check this out, particularly if you like poetry that draws on like myth and folktale. And also deals with homophobia and sexism and discrimination, and interestingly actually the sort of like fetishization of the queer community in modern media. That's something I don't see touched on a lot. I mean, I much more often come across homophobia in the form of hatred in literature, but less do I come across it in the form of fetishization, which is actually a massive problem. So it was really nice to see that sort of like articulated here, and just loved this collection all round. It was really fantastic. Like I said, it just reminded me why I love poetry and inspired me to pick up some new collections and hopefully find some new favourites, because I hadn't been reading as much poetry until I picked this collection up, so thanks. Okay, so that brings me to the 4 books I don't have physical copies of, but I really wish I did. Some I listened to on audiobook, some I read on Kindle, and some were borrowed. But yeah, I like kind of wish I had copies of them all because I love them so much and may very well want to reread them. Some I probably am going to buy because I already want to flick back through them, like Pain and Prejudice by Gabrielle Jackson. A call to arms for women and their bodies. So this book is one I listened to on audiobook, but is also one that I've really ever since just wanted to be able to flick back through and look up specific things in, because it was a non-fiction book all about women's pain and the dismissal of women's pain by the medical profession for centuries, but in particularly still in the modern day, which is the really depressing part. And it's interesting actually, after having talked about Chloe Brown, because one of the pain conditions that is talked about in this book is fibromyalgia, which is something that is much more common in women and for a long time was very much just like equated with hysteria, because you know, like if women, you know, are feeling pain or crap or whatever else with their health, it's surely all in their head. Couldn't be physical, couldn't be real. And it was such an infuriating book, but also a very empowering book. It was like one of those books which just fills you with like righteous fury and makes you want to do something about it. It made me want to go back to the doctor about a million things. I mean, not literally a million things, but it really made me want to like stick up for myself in medical situations. And having had my own problems with my cervix in the past, I mean in the present, like I have ongoing like cervical issues, I know what it is like to sort of be dismissed, to have to speak to multiple people before anybody will take you seriously, before anybody will really sort of like tell you what is going on with your body. I've had countless, particularly cis male doctors show literally like no sensitivity to what I'm experiencing and give me the most ridiculous medical advice, only to talk to like doctors who have their own cervixes later on that have then been able to relate, or at least been able to sympathise and offer me support and help and treatment. Because fun fact, I've had to have my cervix cauterised multiple times. I know, we're really getting into like the medical history side of things here, but I think Pain and Prejudice encouraged me to be open about that, because with a lot of medical conditions which have been dismissed because of their association with women. Now, of course, these are medical conditions that can be experienced by anyone with a cervix, whether they are a woman or not, but their dismissal is often associated with the fact that they're associated with women, if that makes sense. Like, because they are traditionally associated with women and we live in a patriarchy, they've been dismissed, if that makes sense. But then it does affect lots of people. It affects non-binary people and it affects trans men. And the book does acknowledge that, which I think is important. And like I was trying to get at, one of the things I felt like I also took away from this book was to be open, to be honest, to talk about these things. And it's only been in the past few years that I've been able to talk to friends about different conditions that they've had, and we've been able to realise that maybe like we're not some like oddity, and that actually our issues and our problems are more widespread. And then I've read more about it online and in books, and it's been, like I said, very infuriating but also empowering, and this book just like summed it all up. It was fantastic. It touches on endometriosis, as I'm sure many of you are not surprised to hear, because that's one condition in particular which often is very difficult to get a diagnosis for. It also talked about things though that I wasn't aware of at all, like the fact that a lot of heart conditions in women aren't diagnosed because the symptoms are different from they are in cis men, and because the medical research and sort of baseline has been established based on cis men, we ignore the symptoms in women and those with vaginas, and that is so disturbing. I mean, it's not surprising, but it's so disturbing, and it touched on the fact that there's way more medical research into conditions that predominantly affect cis men and all of that fun stuff. I mean, like I said, infuriating, and I'm just rambling here because I'm so angry, but I'm also like, everybody should read this book. And I actually think it's a really good book to read, even if you don't have a cervix, even if you don't have a vagina, even if you don't identify as a woman, because although that is the focus of the book, I think it also just addresses a lot of our struggles with dismissal by like medical professionals, and how commonplace it is to have your pain dismissed, and how many conditions were ignored and overlooked for such a long time before they finally had a diagnosis or any research put into them. And it's a really, really interesting book, and I would really highly recommend it to anybody. I don't know if I articulated that very well at all, but yeah, like, absolutely fantastic. Don't really know what else to say to it. I also found it very accessible, despite the fact that it obviously deals with like a more scientific topic in terms of medicine and pain, because I'm not a scientist. It very much felt like it was written in a well-researched academic way, but that was written for anybody to read. Like, it didn't feel inaccessible or that I was required to have prior knowledge going into it, and that's always important with these kind of books. From medical non-fiction though to fantasy romance, because why not? The next book on my list is Girl of Bone and Ivy, which is written by Damian Callan and Scarlett King. And this isn't actually the last book on this list, which has 2 authors, and I think that's really interesting because there are very few favourite books of mine which were written by 2 authors, and I don't mean anthologies of short stories or poetry. I mean, you know, an entire novel which was a collaborative effort between 2 authors. And it's so interesting to me that this year in particular I found 2 absolute favourites which were combined efforts, because to me that sounds like something that must be so hard because you must have to really gel with the other person. But clearly, if you do, you as a pair are able to create something incredible. And that is true of this. If you like fantasy, romance, then you have to read this book because it was brilliant. It was, I guess, my favourite fantasy book I read this year because, I mean, it's the only like proper, true, like high fantasy novel to make it onto this list. So yeah, like top fantasy of the year. And it is about a young woman who has graduated college. She has her degree in English literature. She wants to be an author. She works in a bookshop, but she's struggling to find her story and she's struggling to like finish her novel. And she is working in the bookshop one day when she is magically transported. Obviously it's a bit more complicated than that, but she's magically transported to another world, and she looks around only to think, where on earth am I? What on earth has happened? Until 2 fairies find her. 2 fairy princes find her and take her back to their kingdom. But this kingdom is full of secrets, and these princes aren't necessarily telling her everything, and she doesn't really know what's going on, and she's desperate to get back home, and they're promising to help her, but are they telling the truth? Can she trust them? Can she trust either one of them? Can she trust both of them? Like, who are these people and what is going on, and how did she specifically end up here? Obviously she has a complicated backstory and we learn a lot more about it, and there's a whole complicated political backdrop to this story, which I obviously don't want to give too much away because I feel like in the beginning you don't really know any of it, so it's nice to learn it with the characters. But it was entertaining, it was captivating, it was magical, and it was pure escapism. And it was one of those books where I just couldn't put it down. Like, I kept turning the pages. It was really well written, and this is a debut novel as well, may I add, which I always feel like is an even more impressive feat because we all grow as writers. So like, how excited am I to see where these 2 writers go together and separately. And I absolutely loved our protagonist. I loved her as a character. She had so many layers. She's also bisexual, and you know I love a little bit of queer rep in my books. I mean, I love a lot of queer rep in my books. So I was obviously really pleased to have that. And the romance that does end up unfolding as the story goes on, again, don't want to say too much about it, is perfect. I love them. There was these lovely moments between like drama and fantasy escapades where you really got to know them and experience them bonding with one another, and it was really, really nice to follow along with. I am so excited for book 2 because I just feel like there's going to be even more of both like the exciting fantastical politics as well as the romance, and it's going to be great. Like, I know it is. I'm so excited for the rest of the series. Will While I'm on the topic of dual-authored novels, however, I do have a sci-fi one to mention, and that is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El Motar and Max Gladstone. So, like I mentioned, this is a sci-fi novel, and it's very, very much like a literary sci-fi novel. This is not a particularly plot-driven novel. I wouldn't even say like it's like half and half character and plot. It's very much a character-driven novel because it's almost in a way an epistolary novel. I mean, it is an epistolary novel, but there's also bits in between which aren't epistolary, where we are reading the letters exchanged by two like alien beings in a far-flung future. Like, I have no idea to this day whether they are like part robot, whether they're androids, whether they're like organic alien creatures, because it's just not clarified, and that's completely fine. Like, you don't care, that doesn't matter. But these two women from opposing sides of a time war, from different alien races who've been raised by very different people in very different societies, but for the same purpose, which is to travel through time, down the timelines, across alternative timelines, the future, the past, the sideways, and prevent or make sure certain things happen in order for their side to win the time war. Although this is very much like an endless battle. Like, it's not a battle where an end is particularly nearby. Nobody can see how it's going to end, but they're constantly like struggling back and forth and pulling between one another. And these two women are on opposite sides, like I mentioned, but after they see one another at a particular historical event, they start leaving notes. And these notes go from like antagonistic to flirty and to emotional and to deep, and it's so nice seeing their relationship develop across these letters. And it doesn't matter that they're aliens, it doesn't matter that it's in wild, far-flung space future timelines that are completely unlike our world right now. They are the most relatable, the most captivating, the most complex, the most real characters to follow on, and their developing love is so tangible and so beautiful, and the writing is so beautiful. It is such a beautifully written book. Wow, do these authors know how to weave a sentence and to weave an atmosphere. Honestly, the world I'm still confused about. Like, I don't entirely feel like I understand the sci-fi world this book was set in, and I'm not sure I was meant to, because it wasn't about that. That was all backdrop. And sure, it was interesting to hear about alternative timelines and important historical events and science fiction future inventions, but that really wasn't the point, and this could have been set anywhere and it could have been just as evocative. But I love the way that it was done, and I thought it was very clever and very emotional, and it wrenched at my heart and had me like hanging on tender hooks, unsure of where things were going, and so like ready to like cry and scream if they didn't go in the way I wanted them to. But that brings me to the final book of this video. I can't really believe it. I've been sitting here for quite a while now. It always takes me a while to film these videos, and they always end up being quite long because naturally when I'm talking about my favourite books of the year, I want to talk about them for a long time. I want to talk about them forever. But yes, the final book, which is A Madness of Sunshine by Nalini Singh. So we return again to the thriller genre, this being a thriller with like a slight romantic side plot. Like, it's not focused on the romance, but it's there. This relationship between the two lead characters is there, and it is an integral part of the story, and it's a part of the story that I really enjoyed that was very complementary to the mystery. And it's set in New Zealand, following two protagonists. We have a Maori woman who had moved away and has not lived in New Zealand for years now, but her husband recently died and she has returned to her home village where she's not been for, like I said, a really, really long time. Like, she never thought she would come back, but here she is, and she clearly has her reasons for having left, and we learn what those are as the novel unfolds. And then we have like the newbie, the police officer who only moved there about a year ago and is like the only police officer there. He's the outsider. Doesn't matter that he's been there for a little while now, he's still the outsider, she's the insider, and they end up assisting one another when a young woman goes missing. So this young woman is somebody that our female protagonist knew as a child. She was like a teenager and this little girl was a child and is now a young woman herself. And one day she just never returns from her run. So of course everybody is incredibly worried. There is all of this like wilderness around them, like the natural landscape, which is actually quite like difficult to navigate if you don't know, and hikers have gone missing in there before, but they expect this young woman to know the terrain, to not have gone anywhere dangerous because this is where she grew up, and it's a small community. So who has done something? Is it a stranger in town? Is it one of the locals that everybody thinks they know what is happening, and where is this young woman? And it's the unfolding of this mystery about past mysteries, and also these two protagonists getting to know one another and helping one another. And it is such a well-written novel. Like, I was so invested in the storyline, but I also felt like I was in New Zealand. Like, the atmosphere in this book was so evocative, it was so rich, it was so deep, and it desperately made me want to go to rural New Zealand. I was like, I feel like I'm there, but I can't see it when I look up from the page, so somebody put me on a plane because I want to be there now. It sounded beautiful. The author really brought it to life, and I think that's what really, you know, just like edged that book up for me, because it felt so much more tangible given how atmospheric and how richly detailed the landscape was. I loved that aspect of it, and I really enjoyed the character development and the mystery on top of that, so it was fantastic all round. But those are my top 10 books of 2021. I hope you've enjoyed this video and maybe discovered a new read, or at least been pushed to read something you were considering reading anyway. Let me know if you're interested in any of them, if I've sold you on any of them. And I'd also love to hear what your favourite read of 2021 is, because I'm going to need some books to read in 2022, and you can never have too many. So yeah, let me know in the comments down below. And until next time, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.